بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome to episode 21 of this series, The Authentic Statements of the Companions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In this episode, we'll take the statement of Abdullah ibn Masud r.a, in which he said, الجماعة ما وافق الحق ولو كنت وحدك. In this statement of his, Abdullah ibn Masud r.a is saying that the Jamaat is whatever agrees or affirms with the truth, even if you're on your own. Even if you're on your own. In other words, he's pointing out to the fact that being part of the Jama'a or being the Jama'a are those Muslims who are upon the truth, who are upon the straight path of Allah, who are following the correct teachings of Islam, who are following the Quran and the authentic Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Even if they're few in number, even if, he's saying, if you're on your own. So in other words, he's indicating two things. Number one, the Jama'ah is following the truth, and that's how it's gauged, by the truth, not by what some people might think, by the numbers, the masses, what the majority of people are upon or following. And he's pointing to that again when he says, even if you're on your own, meaning it's not by numbers, it's not according to numbers. So we shouldn't be deceived by how many people might be doing something or believing in something or following something. That in of itself, just a lot of numbers in of itself does not indicate that they're upon the truth, that they're upon what's correct. And on the other hand, just because one person is doing something and they're alone in that, doesn't mean that they're wrong in it. It could be the truth, yet they're the only ones who are establishing it and upholding it and following it. Because that varies from time to time and from place to place. How many people are upon the truth and upon the straight path of Allah and following the true teachings of Islam is going to vary from time to time and place to place. Sometimes you have a lot more, sometimes you have a lot less people, some places you have a lot more people, sometimes you have a lot less people upon that. And now I want to take a minute to expand upon what we've discussed before. The practicing, understanding, and following the teachings of Islam, the way the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and his companions understood and practiced and followed the teachings of Islam, followed the teachings of the Quran and the authentic Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And I'm going to take this episode just as an example, and this applies to everything that we're covering, but in this episode I'm going to expand a little more on this to give an example of how we take the text from the Quran, the different verses related to something specific. We take the different authentic ahadith from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ on that topic or issue of discussion. We take the statements of the companions. We take the statements and commentary of the scholars of the Salaf. And that's how we form our proper understanding of the religion. It's a holistic understanding. It's not just by taking one statement of a companion here, taking one verse from there on its own, or one hadith on its own, and then basing our understanding of the deen on it, but rather we take everything collectively, and that's how we have the right understanding of the deen. That's how we ensure that what we understand of the deen, what we practice of the deen is correct. So with this example, we took the statement of Abdullah ibn Masud. We're going to take one verse, and there's many verses in the Quran in which Allah addresses this, but we're going to take one verse in which Allah says in the Quran, وَإِن تُطِعْ أَكْثَرَ مَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ يُضِلُّوكَ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. And if you follow the majority of people on earth, they will misguide you away from the path of Allah. They will mislead you away from the path of Allah. Again, Allah is telling us in this verse in the Quran, same thing that Abdullah Masud pointed to in his statement there, which is the majority of the people on earth aren't necessarily upon the truth. If we follow the majority of people on earth, they might misguide you away from the path of Allah. In other words, you can't gauge the truth, you can't gauge right and wrong based on how many people are following that. Just because a lot of people are following something doesn't mean it's true. Now let's take a hadith from the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ on that issue as well. The Prophet ﷺ said, عُرِضَتْ عَلَيَّ الْأُمَمِ. The nations have been presented to me. He's talking about on the day of judgment when the different nations come, different prophets come and their nations come with them. And he said, I saw a prophet and he has a small group of followers. And I saw a prophet and he has 1 or 2 followers. And I saw a prophet and he has no followers. Brothers and sisters, some prophets will come on the day of judgment with a few followers, and some will come with a lot of followers. And one prophet will come on the day of judgment, as the Prophet ﷺ is telling us, one prophet will come on the day of judgment with no followers at all. He'll come on his own. If we stop and think for a minute there, all the prophets came with the same message. They all called the people to worship Allah alone and not associate any partners with Him. They all called their people to do good. The details of their message might have varied, might have differed a little bit, but the foundation of their message was the same. All the prophets came with the same message. Yet, we see that some prophets have a lot more followers, and some have few followers, some have less, and some prophets only have 1 or 2 followers, and a prophet will come on the day of judgment on his own with no followers at all. In other words, the number of followers of something isn't an indication of how true or not it is. In that case, that prophet that was calling to that same message that all his fellow prophets was calling to was upon the truth. But even though he was on his own and none of his people might have believed in him and followed him, yet he's still upon the truth. And that does not detract at all from the message that he was calling to and from the truth that he's upon. On the other hand, a lot of people following something false and falling into misguidance and going down the wrong path does not make it right, regardless of how many people are following that. To wrap up this this episode, we'll take a very beautiful statement of Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah that he mentioned from some of the Salaf in his book Madaris al-Salikin, in which he said, stick to the path of the truth and don't feel lonely because there are very few people on that path. And beware of the path of falsehood and don't be deceived by how many people are on that path that is leading them to their destruction. In other words, stick to the truth even if only few people out there are upon that. Even if only few people are calling to it, are establishing it, are upholding it. And avoid falsehood. Don't be deceived by so many people falling into it because they're going down that path that leads to their loss, their own destruction, even if there's so many of them going down that path. So don't be deceived by that. And as we see with this example, we took a statement of a companion, we took a verse from the Quran, we took a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, which is authentic, we took a statement from one of the scholars of the deen, and collectively we have a sound understanding of this issue. Collectively, based on that holistic approach and understanding of the deen, based on looking on all the texts of Islam, looking at the Quran, looking at the authentic Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, looking at what the companions have said, looking at what the early scholars of Salaf have said, looking at what our scholars teach us about these texts and understanding our deen the right way. Barakallahu feekum, jazakumullah khaira, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.